With a bit of imagination, Galicia could be seen as a small model of Central Europe, a multi-ethnic, multilingual area that experienced the same tragedy as Central Europe as a whole. What was also true for Galicia was that the people in the West turned away indifferently, showing no interest, let alone compassion, for the area. A mixture of ignorance and arrogance that's still perceptible here in people's behaviour towards the cultures that are at home here.
The Austrian writer Martin Pollack is among the best experts on a country that has long since ceased to exist, a faraway cosmos that failed in the bloody upheavals of the 20th century. 30 years ago, he published his book To Galicia, an imaginary journey through East Galicia and Bukovina.
The connotations that went with Galicia while it existed were negative in the rest of Austria. Galicia was associated with corruption, dirt, backwardness, and a lack of civilization. Karl Emil Franzos, a German Jewish author, or Austrian Jewish author, who himself came from Galicia, from Chortkov, coined the term Halb-Asien for Galicia, which means half Asia. It wasn't Europe for him anymore, it was half Asia.
Since the first partition of Poland in 1782, Galicia had been Habsburg crown territory. It seemed a more distant place, even to the people of Austria in those days, than it actually is. The western part now belongs to Poland, while East Galicia became West Ukraine.
I undertook my first real trip to East Galicia in the early 90s, after the Soviet Union collapsed. A lot has happened since then. Galicia has become a talking point again. Nevertheless, much is still ignored.
For the world, the images of the murdered demonstrators and the piled-up barricades on Maidan Square in Kiev have long been the symbols of the Ukrainian struggle for its position between East and West. But just like Galicia's image in the past, the image of Ukraine was for a long time fuzzy in the West, and still is. The country was hidden behind the Iron Curtain for too long, much closer to Moscow than to Vienna. Many observers from the West reported on the protests with a curious mixture of admiration and lack of understanding.
I realized that, in fact, many of the journalists who arrived in Ukraine after the beginning of the protests, they didn't have an idea about the situation in this country. They didn't understand why this protest started. So for them, it was on the one hand, it was difficult to understand because they didn't have much knowledge, and on the other hand, they were open to the knowledge. And I also saw this as an opportunity, like my collaboration with them, to make them understand what was going on. We were looking for different opinions. We're talking to different people in order to present all possible points of view.
As a journalist, Olga Tukariuk looked after many colleagues from the West during the protests on Maidan Square. She now works for Hromadske TV, an independent online television station in Kiev. For the young woman from the formerly Austrian town of Czernowitz, the Maidan is the birth hour of a new Ukraine, multi-denominational and multi-ethnic, just like Galicia once was. The people still mourn their relatives and friends who were ambushed and shot here, but there's a growing hope for a better future.
I think Maidan, and then what happened later after Maidan, the Russian annexation of Crimea and these fights that are ongoing in the eastern Ukraine, they definitely contribute to the nation building and to the better understanding of Ukrainians of who they actually are and what is their identity. Because a majority of people in the east and in the south, as you know, are Russian speaking, and they used to be very loyal to Russia. So, and I think many people, they are now passing this process of their internal transformation, and they start to understand more their distinct features as Ukrainians, who are always citizens of this country, which is between Europe and Russia, but which is at the same time similar but also different, both from Western Europe and from Russia.
Yuri Gol was an activist on Maidan Square. Thanks to a bulletproof vest, he survived a shot that hit him in the abdomen. A veteran of a Soviet special unit, he's from Lviv, once known as Lemberg. Like thousands of others from Western Ukraine, he protested for political reform on Maidan Square.
It's very touchy, and sometimes I cry when I remember the scene, and I remember everything. Much blood. It's unforgettable things. It's unforgettable experience. If the person participate in some historical moments, especially like this, probably nobody will forget this for all entire life. The same me.
You know, you feel like, your country was attacked, your city was attacked by some invisible, irrational, black cloud of very meticulously staged madness. And this dark cloud of madness, the dark cloud of evil, covering the 4 million city, aimed to devour the country. And through this darkest 3 months in our life, which here I'm intentionally saying we, our life as a community, our life as a nation, our life as a country. The only place of hope, strength, light, and resistance was Maidan.
The images of the murdered demonstrators on Maidan Square, shot by snipers, won't let writer Oksana Sabuchko go. She's spending a few months as a guest author in Graz, where she wants to process her experiences.
I would say this is the ideal retreat place for an author after half a year in a war-plagued country. So basically, what am I working on now is to restore my writer's sanity and my writer's capacity. The writer in this war turns into a voice, into a fighting voice too, which is the job that you actually were not applying. You kind of become like a public property in the war. You are involved in all those processes, not only as a citizen, but on the professional basis. And then it appears that after a while you just you feel you are destroyed, you know, from inside. Because it is not about creation, it's about pronouncing things.
From Graz to Lviv, the two writers Natalka Sniadanko and Jurko Proshasko have been confronting the different identities in the Ukraine and their historical roots since before the events on Maidan Square. They both work for the literary magazine Radar, which appears in Ukrainian, Polish, and German, 3 languages that were once at home in Galicia. But neither of them is interested in nostalgia. They care about a literary stocktake of society in Western Ukraine.
There are several subjects I work on time and again, or in almost every book. The most important thing for me is Galician life. I write about what I'd like to read myself. On the one hand, there's life in a modern town, which feels quite normal in a story, a novel. And the other thing is the world from the woman's perspective. But not this entirely conventional feminist viewpoint, where that's the most important thing.
Diese ganz konventionelle feministische Sicht, wo das Wichtigste ist.
Instead, it's this normality of a novel being written by a woman. That's what I'm trying to do.
Frau geschrieben ist, und das versuche ich auch so zu machen.
Her first novel, Collection of Passions, addressed the similarities and differences between East and West, and therefore the identities of the post-Soviet society. It's a subject of particular interest to writers of her generation who still grew up during the Soviet era.
We don't just want to describe what it was like. We also want to understand what impact it had, why we turned out the way we did, and what the mental, psychological consequences were. Why are the young people who are just 10 years younger than us so different from us? Because they didn't experience this Soviet trauma. There's a much bigger difference, mentally speaking, from the people who are 10 years older. We're only noticing that now. And that's an interesting literary situation.
Poles, Ruthenians, Germans, and Russians have all found their final resting place at the Lychakivsky Cemetery in Lviv. Many of them were citizens of 5 different states over the course of their lives. The large cemetery is a symbol of the eventful, sorrowful history of Galicia and Ukraine since the First World War.
We can definitely say that many of the problems that exist today go back to those times. History is never over quickly, and many conflicts that we have to live with today originated in the past. A part of modern-day Ukraine used to be Russian. That was where the Ukrainian language was forbidden for the longest time. In the Austrian area, in Galicia, there was much more freedom, including for the Ruthenians and the Ukrainians. The Austrian Ruthenians, the Galicians, if you will, felt like they constituted an elite. They had Ukrainian schools, Ukrainian newspapers, Ukrainian books, and Ukrainian reading rooms, in contrast to the Russian-occupied or Russian part of the Ukraine, where that wasn't the case.
After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the people of Lviv liked to think of themselves as the better, more Ukrainian Ukrainians. The term Galicians started being used again and soon earned the Western Ukrainians the reputation of being arrogant and nationalistic.
Lviv was the center of a cosmos. The body of this city was shaped by the Habsburgs through and through. You don't need a lot of knowledge to sense that. Modern Lviv was built primarily during these 150 years it was ruled by the Habsburg monarchy. And the Lviv we know and love today is a product of that time. Lviv can't avoid being romanticized as part of Galician mythology.
Buildings designed by the Habsburgs' star architects Hermann Helmer and Ferdinand Fellner, and facades of former shops with fascias in German, Hebrew, Polish, and Ukrainian are being spruced up again. Habsburg nostalgia is a good way to make money in the former Vienna of the East. Galicia isn't a name for a region anymore, but as a metaphor, it would seem Galicia's still present in the heads of many Ukrainians.
The one part is this universalist myth. This Galicia was a pluralist world in which many cultures and languages coexisted in peace, where everything was possible. Particular interests didn't play the most important role. Universal statements always took the lead.
Die universalen Aussagen immer die vorderste Hand hatten.
This world fell apart. The concept of community, that it was a shared world, multi-ethnic, where Germans, Jews, Poles and Ukrainians lived side by side, if not with each other, that's a relatively young concept.
Das ist relativ jung.
For a long time, we were an almost literary nation. We existed for a long time as a text only, not as a state and structures, but in texts, songs and ideas. That's why literature still has a high standing. But that doesn't just relate to literature written today, which very much resorts to these old and reborn Galician contents. It rather relates to this imaginary, great library, which we could call the Bibliotheca Galiciana.
And what would this imaginary Galician library be without all the Austrian authors who came from the educated Jewish bourgeoisie and who often wrote in either Polish or German?
The picture these authors painted of Galicia isn't necessarily quite so rosy and nostalgic as we like to make out today. When you read Josef Roth, you can read very negative characteristics of Galicia. He writes about corruption and dirt, and then later this Austrian brutality towards the Galicians, in the First World War, for example.
Das ist auch später dann diese Brutalität der Österreicher gegenüber den Galizianern, zum Beispiel
in the Radetzky March, you find images of masses of Ruthenians being hanged. It's viewed with nostalgia today. Curiously, these images are completely ignored.
The major battles on the Eastern Front during the First World War took place in the Carpathians and around Przemyśl and Lviv, with millions wounded or dead. For the rest of Austria, these soon made Galicia a symbol of senseless death in faraway lands. The German Jewish author Josef Roth built a literary monument to his hated and yet beloved home, writing many novels, essays, and reports. Roth came from the small town of Brody, around 100 kilometers east of Lviv.
It's a rundown, almost broken town. But when I come here, I almost feel a sense of happiness. For me, it's a place where I can come into contact with this texture, this world of Josef Roth. On the other hand, I know very well that he himself tried to get away from here as quickly as possible. He rushed to leave the town as soon as he could. after graduating from school in 1913.
Hat sich beeilt, die Stadt zu verlassen.
Not much seems to have changed in Josef Roth's former high school. His existence was ignored for a long time, but the people of Brody are once again proud of the famous student, whom many consider an Austrian, not a Ukrainian author.
I started translating Josef Roth because I had this intellectual urge after so much injustice happened to him, after he was ignored, even banned for so long. It was important to me to get him back as soon as I could into our current Ukrainian, Galician world. It was obvious to me that he belonged here, that he was one of us. But the more I translated him, novel after novel, the more I distanced myself from this feeling of a purely intellectual task. And the more I was captivated by the power of the literature. In my opinion, it's world literature. It's among the best literature that has been produced.
Das gehört zum Schönsten, was die Literatur hervorgebracht hat.
In the Radetzky March, Josef Roth didn't just describe life in Brody in a multifaceted manner, he also described the Jewish world he came from. It's a world that's almost completely vanished from the modern townscape.
Brody was a largely Jewish town. The majority of the population were Jewish. It was a very pious town. There were many Hasidic Jews, many synagogues and places of worship. It was a cultural town. There were cultured Jews, as the example of Josef Roth shows, but not exclusively. Brody was a symbol of this Jewish Galicia. And then Brody is one of the many towns where Jews were killed in vast numbers during the Third Reich. Brody stands for that too. It's also a symbol of the Holocaust.
Eine Metapher, auch eine Chiffre für den Holocaust.
Kinderjorden, süße Kinderjorden, ewig steht der wach in mein Sikorn. Wenn ich tracht von Eierzeit, wird mir also kalt und leid. Oi, wie schnell bin ich schon alt geworden. Oi, der Stiefel steht mir vor die Augen. Oi, ich bin geboren, aufgezogen. Euch das Wiegel seh ich dort, steht noch auf demselben Ort. Die Achollen ist das Holz verfolgen.
Alfred Schreier was the last Jew from the Galician small town of Drohobych to be born before the Second World War. The never-ending violence of the 20th century, the Nazi obsession with racial purity, and the subsequent ethnic cleansing operations under Stalin have eliminated the old Galician world forever.
Galicia,
that's nothing but memories. The old people who experienced the old Austro-Hungarian monarchy used to say how good it was under the Austrians. It was a good life for everyone who lived here. For the Poles, the Ukrainians, and the Jews.
Und für die Polen und für die Ukrainer und für die Juden.
Drohobych was the typical small Galician town with a large Jewish population. Between 1919 and 1939, when the German troops invaded, the town belonged to Poland, then briefly to the Soviet Union. But when the German Reich attacked the Soviet Union in 1941, terror broke out in all its might in Drohobych once more.
Ich habe
I was very fortunate to remain alive. A ghetto was arranged in Drohobych. The ghetto was liquidated in the summer of 1943, and the forced laborers were mostly shot. Of the Jewish population, around 500 people were saved. And that's of 42,000 Jews. Of the Jews who were born in Drohobych before the war, I really am the last.
The eventful history of the country still shapes the consciousness of many of the people in Western Ukraine. The wars of independence with Poland and Russia after 1918 are evoked, as is the old Austrian Galicia.
In this cemetery has a big meaning, especially for me, because here is buried my uncle who participated during 1970s, during 1980s. He participated in a big war in Austro-Hungarian Empire against Russian Muraviev forces. It's a great story, a great life. My uncle was born in 1902, and he lived 89 years. And he died in 1991, just a year before Ukraine was liberated, got the freedom. He reflects Galician Ukrainian history, and my Galician identity comes from a person like him. He is a good example for young generation.
Of course, there are many young Ukrainians fighting for an independent Ukraine today without looking towards the confrontations of war of the past. There are the members of the Lviv band Zhish Orchestra, who also played on Maidan Square for the demonstrators.
Well, Maidan changed a lot, and Maidan showed a lot. It was impossible to stay at home and look just what is going on. We can influence on something, and that's the point. With the music or with the persistence or staying nights on the watch. We didn't think about the risk. It's not a question of risk. It's just you have to be there because you can do something.
And it's the feeling that you can change the history. It's the most beautiful feeling, patriotic feeling if the people come together. It's what this means, Maidan, for me, is the heart of Ukraine.
Maidan was like this feast of resistance of the whole nation, because there were people from all over the country.
Und der Euromaidan von 2000.
The Euromaidan of 2013, 2014 really changed everything. It destroyed a lot of myths, including our own myths, and it turned the entire modern Ukraine into a universal Galicia.
Universelles und universales Galicien gemacht.
Coping with the fear and helplessness was the most important achievement of the Maidan for me personally. And that's got a lot to do with the Galician way of thinking and Galician self-confidence.
It definitely is a process in which the people are finding themselves in Ukraine today. It's about the Ukrainian identity. It's an identity for the whole of the Ukraine, because almost everyone in the Ukraine now wants a unified Ukraine with all the differences. If it ends well, which I hope for the people there, it could contribute to building a stronger Ukraine than there was before.
Eine gestärkte Ukraine hervorgeht aus dem Ganzen.
Залаєш ми в злу годину,